Heinrich Himmler was one of Hitler's closest associates and the head of the SS, Schutzstaffel, an elite Nazi organization. The SS was not only Hitler's bodyguard, but also a huge structure that controlled the police, concentration camps, and penal institutions. Himmler developed and implemented racial policies, the cleansing of the German nation, sterilization programs, and the selection of racially valuable children. It was under his leadership that the Holocaust was carried out, the systematic extermination of Jews and many other peoples. Himmler believed in mysticism, the occult, and sought to transform the SS into a new order of knights that would rule for millennia. When we talk about Nazi Germany, most people think of Hitler. But behind the Führer stood those who created a terrible mechanism of mass terror. One of them was Heinrich Himmler, the man who turned the SS from a small security group into a huge empire of death.
A man who at first glance seemed unremarkable, even weak. But he was the one who turned Nazi ideology into a machine of mass terror, a machine that became inseparable from the Second World War. To understand why Himmler contributed to the war, we first need to see his role within the Nazi state. He was the head of the SS, an organization that started as Hitler's personal guard, but grew into a massive power. Under his control were concentration camps, the police, intelligence services, and even his own armed forces, the Waffen-SS. In practice, Himmler created a state within a state in Germany.
But the strength of the SS was not only in weapons, it was rooted in ideology, which Himmler spread with fanatical devotion. He believed in the racial superiority of the so-called Aryans, and he saw war as a necessary tool to cleanse Europe of undesirable peoples. Jews, Roma, Slavs, all those the Nazis considered inferior. For him, this was not just politics, it was a mission. Himmler was the one who organized the system of concentration camps. At first, they were used to isolate political opponents. But once the war began, the camps turned into factories of death. Millions of people were murdered because of this system. Himmler personally oversaw deportations and chose the locations for new camps. The war gave him new opportunities. In the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, his units carried out mass executions. Villages were burned, civilians exterminated, and the survivors were sent to forced labor. The SS police battalions left behind thousands of victims in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. For Himmler, this was part of the Lebensraum plan, to drive out or destroy local populations and settle Germans on their land. His influence also extended to the battlefield. Under his leadership, the Waffen-SS became a powerful military force. They fought fanatically, but also left a trail of brutality. Executions of prisoners of war, massacres of civilians, punitive actions. Himmler shaped them into an army of ideological warriors, absolutely loyal to Hitler and the Nazi cause. His speeches inspired not only through fear, but also through the idea of a sacred mission. He claimed that Germans had to be merciless, that they must know no pity. In this way, he gave war a moral justification. It was not merely a fight for territory, but a struggle for the survival of the race. And yet, at the end of the war, his fanaticism could not save him. When Germany was on the verge of defeat, Himmler tried to secretly negotiate with the Western Allies. Hitler discovered this betrayal and dismissed him. Soon after, in May 1945, Himmler was captured by the British. He never stood trial at Nuremberg. He killed himself by swallowing poison. So why did Himmler contribute to the war? Because he was not only an executor, but the chief architect of Nazi terror. He created the system of concentration camps. He organized deportations and mass killings. He turned the SS into both a military and ideological weapon. And he transformed the war into more than a clash of armies, into a war against entire nations. Without Himmler, the Second World War might have looked very different. Perhaps it would not have become such a universal tragedy for civilians. But his fanatical belief in Nazi ideas, combined with his cold organizational talent, turned the war into one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. But to truly understand Himmler's role, we must look beyond the battlefield and the concentration camps. Himmler was not only a commander, he was an engineer of ideology. He believed that the war was not just about conquering land, it was about reshaping humanity itself. He dreamed of a new Europe ruled by the SS, his Order of Knights. Children were to be raised in special schools, taught obedience, racial pride, and loyalty to the Reich. Marriage and family life were strictly regulated. Himmler encouraged selective breeding, rewarding those who produced racially pure offspring. Even in times of war, he thought about the future. A future without Jews, without Slavs, without anyone who did not fit his vision of the Aryan Empire. This vision gave the war its most horrific dimension. It was not simply about battles between armies. It was a war of extermination, a war against people who were denied the right to exist. Himmler's SS carried out massacres in forests, shootings on the edges of ravines, and mass deportations by train. Everywhere the German army advanced, the SS followed, bringing terror in their wake. And yet, despite all his power, Himmler lived in the shadow of Hitler. He rarely made public appearances, and many saw him as a bureaucrat rather than a soldier. But this apparent modesty concealed ruthless ambition. He wanted to be more than Hitler's servant. In his mind, he was preparing to become the true guardian of the Reich, the one who would ensure its survival for 1,000 years. When the war turned against Germany, Himmler's desperation grew. He ordered even harsher measures, scorched earth tactics, mass executions, and forced marches of camp prisoners, known as death marches. Tens of thousands perished in those final months as the SS tried to cover their crimes. In the end, Himmler failed. His empire of fear collapsed with the fall of the Third Reich. His attempt to negotiate with the Allies revealed his hypocrisy. The man who had demanded absolute loyalty betrayed his own Führer when the war was lost.
was one of the most
His
powerful
suicide
men
was
in
the
Nazi
final
Germany,
act of cowardice
and one of the
from a
central
man who had
figures
built his
responsible
life
for
on
turning
cruelty.
Adolf Hitler's ideology into reality. Born in 1900, he seemed unremarkable in his early life, but within the structure of the Nazi Party, he discovered both purpose and power. As head of the SS, he controlled not only Hitler's elite guard, but an entire empire of police, intelligence, and military formations. By the late 1930s, the SS had become a state within the state, and Himmler used it to enforce racial laws, run concentration camps, and suppress opposition. When the war began in 1939, his influence expanded dramatically because the occupation of Poland and then the invasion of the Soviet Union opened vast territories where his plans of racial cleansing could be carried out. Himmler believed that the war was more than a military conflict. For him, it was a crusade to reshape Europe according to Nazi racial doctrine. He argued that Germans needed Lebensraum, living space, in the East, and that this space could be secured only by removing or destroying the populations who lived there. This idea translated directly into mass killings, deportations, and the creation of ghettos and extermination camps. Himmler was not a battlefield commander, but he was the architect of the machinery that turned war into genocide. The SS units under his command carried out mass shootings, most notoriously by the Einsatzgruppen, who murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, and political opponents in occupied territories. Later, he oversaw the industrialized murder in extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Himmler's speeches to his SS officers revealed his worldview. He demanded absolute loyalty, praised hardness of heart, and portrayed extermination as a duty to the German race. He also sought to shape the future beyond the war, creating breeding programs and racial policies intended to build a new ruling class loyal only to the SS. In this sense, he gave the war a dimension far more terrifying than ordinary conflict. It became a war of annihilation, aimed not at defeating armies, but at erasing entire peoples. His influence extended to military matters as well, through the Waffen-SS, which grew into a large armed force fighting alongside the Wehrmacht, but distinguished itself by fanaticism and brutality against civilians and prisoners of war. As Germany's situation worsened after 1943, Himmler became increasingly ruthless, ordering mass deportations, accelerating killings, and forcing prisoners on death marches to prevent them from being liberated. At the same time, he secretly sought ways to secure his own survival, attempting to negotiate with the Allies behind Hitler's back. This betrayal cost him his position in the final days of the regime.
Captured by British forces in May 1945, he committed suicide with a cyanide capsule before he could be brought to justice. Himmler's contribution to the Second World War was not measured in military victories, but in human suffering. By organizing and directing the machinery of terror, he ensured that the war became not only a struggle between states, but also one of the greatest crimes in human history. His legacy is inseparable from the Holocaust and from the millions of victims of Nazi racial policy. He shows how a seemingly ordinary man, driven by ideology and ambition, can become an architect of mass murder when placed in a system that rewards cruelty and loyalty above all else.
Heinrich Himmler's story is one of the clearest examples of how ideology, bureaucracy, and ruthless ambition can combine to create destruction on an unimaginable scale. As the architect of the SS and the overseer of the concentration camp system, he gave the Second World War a dimension that went far beyond traditional warfare, transforming it into a war of annihilation. What made Himmler particularly dangerous was not charisma or military genius, but his ability to organize, to delegate, and to turn Hitler's vague racial visions into precise plans and structures. He was the man who ensured that the persecution of Jews evolved into systematic extermination, who transformed ghettos into staging grounds for mass deportations, and who oversaw the development
Of Auschwitz into an industrial site of death. His infamous speeches to SS leaders, such as at Posen in 1943, revealed his cold determination. He openly acknowledged the extermination of the Jewish people as a duty, praising the supposed decency of those who carried it out without faltering. These words exposed not only his cruelty, but also his obsession with loyalty and obedience. He wanted the SS to see themselves not merely as soldiers, but as a chosen order tasked with remaking Europe according to racial doctrine. The scale of his power was immense. He commanded not only the Waffen-SS divisions fighting on the front, but also the police forces in occupied territories, the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and even the resettlement agencies that planned the future of conquered lands. Through projects such as General Plan Ost, he envisioned the removal or enslavement of tens of millions of Slavs to make way for German settlers. This plan was never fully realized, but its outlines shaped policies of mass deportation, starvation, and forced labor. Under Himmler's direction, millions were uprooted from their homes and sent into brutal labor that supported the German war machine. The cruelty was not accidental, but systemic, designed to weaken populations and clear space for a racial utopia that existed only in Nazi imagination. When the tide of war turned against Germany, Himmler did not retreat from his vision but doubled down on brutality. He ordered scorched earth tactics, demanded that prisoners be marched away from the advancing Allies in deadly treks that killed tens of thousands, and continued to press for absolute resistance even as defeat became certain. Yet at the same time, he revealed his opportunism and cowardice, seeking secret contacts with Western powers in the hope of saving himself and negotiating a role in a post